Welcome to our third lecture of this fall lecture series. Today with a very special guest, Chris Meyer from Atelier May. And to introduce Chris, I'm going to invite Professor Nick Jelpy to come and do the honors. Nick. Yes.
Hey, everyone. Very happy to introduce Chris. I'll just say, I think I first met Chris at our master project reviews pre-COVID at Miami Beach Urban Studio when he was part of a new cohort at and it's really great to meet him. That was pre-COVID, and then I think we haven't seen each other since then. But I keep hearing and seeing all the great things he's been doing. And to tell you a little bit about Chris runs a lab at titled the LU Lab. LU stands for Littoral Urbanism. And so I hope the students are asking themselves, what is littoral? I also wasn't quite sure. I thought maybe a fancy word for literal. But littoral describes an environment along the coast or a shoreline near the water. Inadequate description for our environment here in Miami. Chris and his wife, Shauna, have an architectural design firm, Atelier May. Students, you should check out their website. They have much work under their project tab, and I appreciate the format. Projects don't have titles, rather numbers, and there are no project descriptions. There's no words. And I'm not disparaging him when I say that. I appreciate this fact. I find it interesting. It makes the projects curiosities. They're almost without label. It makes them not so searchable, even though some clearly fit into categories such as single-family houses. But their numbering system makes them more unified, not grouped into separate pots or silos, but all a part of the same type of collective approach. And I think the firm is described as a collective of architects and designers. The plans are beautifully drawn, and again, I encourage you students to please look at the plans. They're somewhat small. You have to zoom in. There's a lot of detail. There's much admirable work on the site, and I'm looking forward to hearing about all that they are doing. But for me, what I've heard most about and what I'm looking forward to hearing about today is their house, titled Project 038. And if you search this out elsewhere, I found the title of the house is titled A House in the Garden. Much can be made of the house, and was speaking to Chris at lunch, and I know maybe he's growing tired of talking about the house, which is a good problem to have, Chris. It's a courtyard house, but I think the house is very special for a number of reasons. One is it's a courtyard house, which I also live in a courtyard house. And a number of us here at FIU, I'll admit it, I have a slight fetish for courtyards. But in addition to that, I believe it is the first mass timber house in South Florida. Many of you may have heard that. I hope you students, if you haven't heard that, are now thinking, what is mass timber? I'll let Chris explain. But something that I've become increasingly interested in and curious to hear more about. But to me, that is also not the only thing that makes the house special. The house has a very crafty scalloped metal cladding. They refer to it as a perforated parasol. I was speaking with Chris's son at lunch, who had the joy of helping to install this cladding, and I find it to be a very remarkable detail of the house. It almost suggests the vertical bundles of tubes found within the microstructure of a tree. The house is made of trees. It's compellingly beautiful in its light and shadow and reflectivity. Again, my words, not from their website. But some of our students have visited Chris's house through Professor James Brazil's studio this past summer and have excitedly told me about it. They all asked me, Professor, have you been to Chris Meyer's house? It's very cool. And I dejectedly answer, no, I have never had the opportunity, but it sounds very cool. Maybe someday. And that is not why I volunteered to introduce you, Chris. I'm not shopping for an invite, but I'm free next Wednesday and Thursday. As a matter of personal conduct, I always bring a warm loaf of bread as a housewarming gift. Just saying. Lastly, I'll just return to the fact that Chris is a faculty member from the University of Miami, and which seems strange that we're in the same city. It seems a long way from us here at FIU. For some reason, we're in the same city, but it's rare that we overlap all that much. It's not that often that we come to you or you come to us, and I feel that should be different. I hope that could be different, and I hope you'll come back. With that, I want to say thank you to Chris for making the long trek across town and for being here at FIU. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Nick. All right. Well, Wednesday, if you would like, it's the door's open for you. Thursday, Friday, whatever you need. Okay, so first, thank you for the wonderful introduction. I greatly appreciate this opportunity. Henry, thank you for extending the opportunity to talk over here with this wonderful group. You guys have been good hosts every time I've been around, so it's actually, I guess, me, not you, why I'm not coming across town. So hopefully we can change that. I also think it's important for you guys as students to recognize all the important work that is happening over here. As I share a city with you, I'm actually very excited for all of the accomplishments you guys have been able to make. I think your faculty and student body itself has been able to contribute to elevating South Florida's education to, I believe it's number 4 in the country and number 20 for architectural schools for the 3rd consecutive year, or in the 20s, I think 17. So that is an amazing accomplishment. You guys should be very excited about that, being part of that community. I want to thank you guys for working so hard as an institution to do so in the community. I never fail to run across an FIU student that doesn't excite me and bring some level of diligence to the work. So congratulations for all of that work you've been able to accomplish. You should feel strong about your school. So as was mentioned, I am Chris. I have a partner, Shauna Meyer. We do run a practice here in Miami. It is a Miami-based practice, meaning that we live and work in the city. One of the concerns that we have as a practice is thinking through what is deemed as a very seemingly simple question, which is to understand, how do we build? So for us, what it's asking is to slow down, to look around and understand the ground of which one stands upon. This is a search for an architecture of nearness. So from a standpoint of some of the slides you're going to see today, I just want you to understand it's kind of a larger arc. So you're going to set a project up and then move into the architecture itself. So the global landscape dominating the contemporary world is fast, sensational, and fleeting. There's a thin context from which placelessness has emerged. Conversely, the undercurrent of forces responsible for creating placeness imbues cultural history, social structures, environmental evolutions, and human virtuosities. The unearthing of these architectures of place is bound to nearness and is attentive of the local and aware of its present. So nearness is not simply the measurement of distance between things, if you will, nor can it state nearness be acquired by merely bringing two disparate things closer together. We must acknowledge that the act of consumption, we are kind of a culture of consumers, and through our work, we question characteristics of consumption in terms of place and placelessness. For us, nearness is ingrained in the understanding of things and subsequently in the development of empathy for the position of these things hold. So it is dependent on space and time. It is comfortable with difference and understanding of inefficient processes. It transcends scale. It understands economies but does not follow them blindly. It imbues honesty. Nearness is attentive to the local and again aware of its presence. Bless you. The act of building forces a reconciliation of place, a physical engagement with the things that make up our environment. So the forest for us has been a resource of more than just construction materials. A careful consideration reveals its energetics, carbon, questions of carbon, environmental questions, economics, cultural underpinnings, which are important to balancing this kind of relationship between the building and landscapes, both near and far. Our architecture is found in the nearness of culture and craft, energy and environment, people and place. So our recent work includes developing an agenda connecting the forest to building.
leveraging the potentials of a forest to foster a wood language for architecture. So the question of how do we build, just a small backdrop in a portion of our office here, it's grounded in the kind of characteristics of consumption. If it ever was, it no longer is practical to extract, remove, in effect, pillage one place for the benefit of another. As architects, we must lead the innovation through a more critical understanding of building consumption. The United Nations, as I'm sure you guys are all keeping up with as students, you're worried about what the United Nations are talking about. That program states that that building and their construction account for about 39% of energy-related CO2 emissions. It means that we all have a lot of work to do. Now, I'm not necessarily here to kind of talk to you about studio work or any of that kind of stuff. What I am here to do is set kind of forth our project agenda as a firm. Hopefully that will connect the kind of work you're going to see in a little bit. So through an acknowledgement of consumption, we question building through three different lenses: ecology, efficiency, and efficacy. So if we think about the kind of idea of ecology, through our work, we engage these ideas of consumption through the understanding of relationships. So that kind of definition for ecology. Now, if there's foresters in the crowd, we often get yelled at because they don't like to see the term ecology used for anything other than kind of natural landscape. But for us, we are thinking about architecture as a relationship of organisms that are kind of relating to each other in their physical surroundings. So when we think about building ecology, these processes establish a primary goal of building as a negotiator with the environment. So what is building performance, and how do we evaluate it as designers, builders, consumers? Now, what we are kind of in the middle of discussing are two different terms. One of efficiency, which is to engage the question of how we build, is to challenge these kind of accepted standards or normalizations of a process. So contemporary building practices offer expanded methodologies to construct material assemblies through ideas of efficiencies. But today we understand buildings as multivalent. We must engage building materials and material palettes through a more rigorous understanding of fabrication, extraction, cultivation, and application. So how do we value efficiency? And is it the right way to quantify architecture? Maybe more importantly to us, we're interested in the idea of efficacy. So it's kind of redefining for us a material strategy. So the deployment of wood fiber, for instance, in the projects I'm going to talk about today, as a building material is ingrained in the history of our building vocabulary. However, contemporary design and construction strategies require an involved line of questioning, linking the forest to the building, energy to matter, culture to craft, ecologies to economies, and then definition of material strategy is at hand. I was going to take that. I'm joking. It doesn't. He just stole my sweater. No. The people on Zoom are like, what's going on? Nobody stole my sweater. Okay. So we're interested in to do more with all. This approach to do more with all, I could argue, is a more sophisticated approach than the contemporary building methods, as it deploys a material that is otherwise labeled as potentially a waste product, and it expenses material behavior free or forced from structural adaptations that depend on energy-intensive materials and process. It simply is. So this is the reduction of what I would define here as high grade energy materials like steels and concretes, etc., for a low grade energy materials like wood fiber. And so this is kind of the localized condition of what we live in now. All right, so if we think about kind of the idea from forest to building and how do we build, what you see here is a series of photos that represent upstream contributors for us. So continuing to explore the idea of efficacy over efficiency, we enjoy the idea of mass making with timber and the return to the idea of linking the forest to building. This is a different approach, I think, than the thinness of architecture that has surfaced in the last 10 to 15 years in terms of material palettes and building assemblies themselves. So energy to matter and ecologies to economy are important. As a practice, we are interested in the idea of a regional material and regional process. Buildings are, by default, a territorial act. To make a wood building means that, in some ways, we are essentially constructing a forest. Thus, to make a steel and concrete building, we are unearthing, parsing out, and dissipating large amounts of geological strata. So I want to be clear that our office is not bound to a single material or process. The architectures that we conceive of are not bound to wood. Like, you're going to see wood today, but it's not the only thing that we are interested in. or is particular mass timber, which is quite compelling, but not the only thing that we're interested in. What we are interested in is an architecture that acknowledges the significance of place, that it's performative and to a certain degree embraces the ideas of science as much as our profession has fawned over the art of architecture. Now, I might get in trouble for that. Um, so when we look at the kind of context of what I showed you of that wood processes, all of those things here exist either in the state of Florida or they are just outside of our boundaries, the political boundaries. So when we look at the maps that are here, we essentially have a state that is over 50% forested, meaning that we have the idea of localized conditions to deal with. Why are we not using this material more pervasively? Which there are answers to those questions, but for us, it is a challenge for the practice. So our office is in search of a material agenda for architecture. This is kind of critical for us. And if you do not believe me, this is us looking for it as we build things. So the kind of context for material strategies is to understand what the forest can offer in this instance, and then what his architectures might be moving forward. All right, so uh, want to talk about a little bit of some projects across time, but this is going to be something that's more of a photographic exercise. So surface tension was us looking at a publication, a portion of a publication. This is one of our the first projects in a single vein of a series of explorations that came out of Pamphlet Architecture 36, titled Buoyant Clarity. So a series of photographs that are examining the architectures that are stippling the landscape of the Mississippi Delta, which, believe it or not, for us, looks like this at some points. At other points, it looks a little bit like this. So the architecture of the Delta, as understood as a confluence of forces, some clearly visible, some not so much, some meager in strength, some with great power, some of necessity, and some of resourcefulness, some that address political structures and others that cannot. The forces responsible for shaping these buildings directly impact form, tectonics, materiality, economic investments, and on and on and on. And the architecture of the city, El Rossi, connects for us form and the way of life as a driving force behind the development of type, or linking the variation of form to society or pace. The architecture of the Mississippi River Delta owns a particular relationship between necessity and beauty, specifically the dynamic dialogue between structure and character of the enveloping context. The photographic series for us takes aim at the circumstances of form, identified by Alderossi as the widely varied interpretation of type, specifically the relationships form establishes between need and these aspirations to beauty. It is important to note the work does not discount or condemn any specific contextual building type, but rather works to expose the architectures left unconsidered as potential contributors to the design discipline. These buildings are straightforward, their intentions are clear, their form and materiality is honest. Oops, sorry. Inhabitation in the territory defined by the Mississippi River and Chafalaya River Delta is an education in entropy, a tireless effort to regenerate one's steady existence. Endured as an ever-changing landscape to inhabit this dynamic territory is kind of the relentlessness of water. There's a constant awareness of its presence, even in its absence. These buildings teach about material properties and characteristics, structure, enclosure, assembly, and time, most importantly. In the case of the Delta, we find the here and now, there and gone circumstance of the Delta a clear and exciting example of nearness. The water of the Delta is all around and inescapable. The water rises to unimaginable heights and is the life source of its territory. Clearly, this is an oversimplification, an all but tragic generalization of the descriptor of place for this area. The architecture exposes an exhaustive dialogue with water. The photographic series focuses on the building. However, water as the character is inescapable in its presence. Only the trace of its nearness is presented. The elevation of the buildings are tenuous, the water lines are clearly legible, twisted and eroded foundations show the work of the building to endure. The Delta buildings are honest depictions of circumstance. There is no attempt to mask, conceal the severity of their setting, nor are they a pursuit of aesthetics. We see these buildings as interested in performance. There is an understanding of place, there's a humility in their soul and reality and their materiality and tectonics. The buildings are not hiding, they are comfortable. While these buildings hold little to no clout amongst the discipline of architecture, they are not awarded honors, they do not find limelight in publication. Still, we as a practice believe they have a lot to teach us about energy and environment, architecture and construction, and most importantly for this lecture today, about placeness. So I want to say first, um, these are clearly fake Velcro key covers. They're not real. I have to say that because I get in trouble after lectures when I show this stuff. But nevertheless, we find them to be very kind of interesting methods to provoke a conversation about what design disciplines were interesting or significant in the time. By sliding these buildings onto the cover of a respected architectural publication, they transcend their social, cultural, and economic baggage. Their credibility of El Croquis allows us to look past whether these buildings are important or interesting to find what is important and interesting about them. Their character of soul draws us near, and we listen to their stories. They have lessons to teach. The project reminds us to be good observers and to do our best at leaving behind preconceptions. As we move into the presentation of the work, please keep in mind about this format as we go through so you can kind of track it. I want to take a moment here just to say that the format of the presentation is going to be 4 projects in total, but there's going to be little interludes. And since we're in an academic setting, I'm trying to find a way to tie those 2 things together. So there's going to be a miniature project in between a project that will be really quick. So our first interlude here is about think make. So as a practice, we believe the work of design is greatly benefited by making our ideas. This is critical to us. So as the words of Richard Sennett ring out, we believe deeply in the construction between thinking and making, praxis and practice, and the head and the hand. So the firm makes. We make things in the office. We make things just outside of the office, wherever we can. We test cladding systems for processes of construction, technique, and answering questions of maintenance, for example. You can see that in the kind of blue-black studies here, what that's about. Essentially, we are looking for an understanding of materiality. We are cutting, we are bending, we are folding, splitting, painting, so that we understand as designers what's happening. And then we often find ourselves engaging in the building of our projects to help contractors take on tasks maybe they're not comfortable with because there's something new about it. So we find ourselves bouncing back and forth between digital fabrication and analog craft. What does it mean to do something in a kind of with a CNC to take out to a job site and explain how something is going to be made, or set up processes to do very specific tasks like route in or recess in switch boxes. We do bounce back and forth between this idea of prefab, which I do question whether or not it's prefab or manufactured, and also the kind of nature of in situ. So there's things that have to happen on site that can happen in the factory and vice versa. If you are only on one side of that coin, you're not going to understand the other side clearly. So we are oftentimes away from the office doing things that we call being towards the project site. So what you're seeing here is a number of buildings that we have been part of the kind of erection of their structures, and some of them are our designs and some of them are not. We are fortunate to have made good friends in the discipline just outside. In particular, one individual, Daniel Worth with Minimal Impact Engineering, has graciously extended an opportunity to go learn the craft of making where we can't get it in the office, and that's very exciting for us. Okay, so interlude first one, move past. We will move into a little project that we did as a pavilion. Again, linking this idea of making and thinking together. This was a project in which our practice partnered with a design build program in Boston, where we essentially asked, what can we do with 1,000 2x4s? So kind of a simple question again, and we looked at this as 1,000 2x4s, and then we're lucky enough to get a partnership with a pneumatic nailing company, Beck Fasteners, to do an all wood structure. So students came together to work with the practice to figure out what we can do with those. They started stacking them together. They started moving through all of the kind of iterations. They did full scale mock-ups where on the top you can actually see that that's across a couple tables, so they could go inside of it from below. We worked back and forth kind of from real to kind of digital stuff, drawing and making simultaneously. This project was a total of 3 weeks from start to finish, and you can see them actually prefabbing it in a kind of in a shop area and drawing it and understanding the kind of relationships of what they were learning through the process, as well as what the practice was able to kind of contribute. So the switch from in the kind of manufacturing facility for them or the shop area out to the site, they began assembling this structure together. And the final artifact for them, kind of the way it came together was essentially a mass stack. So this is an early interpretation of what maybe a rethinking of availability of local resources and just the kind of local 2x4 cut up and very specifically based on some digital. So the relationship between analog and digital could provide. So I'll just kind of walk around the building. The structure was essentially this kind of relationship of transparency, translucency, and opacity, as well as a bit of a composition. Was in on near the Wentworth campus across from the MFA for those interested in Boston. And so the mass stack came together in about a week total. Has no metal in it, and there's no foundation. It sits there. It's gone now, but it sits there as a pavilion and as an inhabitable space to exist in the summer months. You can see the kind of relationship of light and space that the kind of pavilion was allowed to offer. But actually most exciting for us is this relationship of what happens at the end of a building life. So the building was essentially taken down and stacked up as a bunch of 2x4s, and we were left with this kind of chunk of wood. And ultimately they repurposed this into localized fences and gave them to the kind of community to continue building with. Because there was no metal in it, it was simple to kind of repurpose. So there's the idea of deconstruction while constructing, and that was also part of the design portion. So a little interlude here about some testing. Now this is going to bring us to Miami, kind of reposition us here in Miami. Now we are, most of the crowd is way too young for this, but if you guys, can use your phones to look up some historical things, what you're going to see here is kind of ultimate devastation across South Florida. It was a very, very bad time after 1992 when Hurricane Andrew came to shore. It really caused a shift, a really big monumental shift in building policy. And you ask yourself, well, why does this matter? When you sit down to think through architecture, if you want that architecture to manifest into a building, well, this all of a sudden becomes very important. So what happens in 1992 and subsequently the moments after is something that changes the nature of building. It shifts architecture. The kind of place all of a sudden arrives, and we understand that there is it's kind of a current that is going to shift how we build. It is a very complicated place to build, is in Miami-Dade County. So post 1992, what we find is that there is this thing put in place called the high velocity hurricane zone. And it did three things that you guys have to keep in mind as you think about architecture. So for us, it changed the kind of, or for the discipline of architecture in South Florida, it was a comprehensive shift towards a single material set, meaning that it kind of blanked out other stuff and went right to concrete and steel. And this was a kind of a unification from single family all the way through mid-rise and beyond. That commitment towards a single process shifted essentially the skill sets of local trades. So what could you actually expect out of local trades? That kind of changes the nature of what your craft of buildings can really be. That narrow perspective that the discipline is now offering as buildings ultimately changed the way that the buildings were evaluated by the AHJs. And so it became a really kind of myopic, singular, narrowed lens of what buildings could or should be here. So you'll see how this kind of pops up in the future. So we were interested in saying, okay, well, state is 50% forested. We have a lot of complications in our material sets, and we have a lot of complications in environment. What can we do? And as Coleman Coker points out to us here, because we're immersed in thinking and building, it does not mean that we're indifferent to the world. So we came up with this little project as part of a grant. There's a binding between our office and the lab, where we were looking at what the opportunities were for post-storm questions of building, which also kind of links into potentially for us a starter home mentality. So what you're seeing on the screen is the FEMA trailers that are deployed at the end of a disaster scenario. And it's kind of a ubiquitous landscape. Well, we were thinking, okay, if we take that trailer set and we like reposition it against something maybe like the forest, and we say, well, what would happen? What can we do? Is there a way for that to engage in a productive way to make healthy buildings? we go back to our regional map and say, well, we have regional resources in manufacturing. As you can see, our first moment here up near Dothan, Alabama, can get us resources into building components that are applicable really fast. So we think, okay, well, where can we engage? And you look at the kind of FEMA structure, and what's compelling to us is that it's kind of like that diagram that gets you always to the same spot, which is essentially to relocate people out of a community and then try to bring them back slowly. But that displacement is complicated for the livelihood and the kind of vibrance of a community and really an investment in that community. So we pointed to these moments about swiftness, speed, durability, long-term um, propositions, but they all had to happen in very short order. So from the kind of point, we looked at a local neighborhood. This happened to be, I think, in Coconut Grove here. That's just behind the kind of Green Street area. And so we said, well, if we can take something and do something really quickly and design the process, not the architecture per se, but the process, then maybe we can come up with an architecture that's quite compelling. So utilizing mass timber and then thinking back to our kind of state as a driver for interesting building typologies, the Florida Cracker House stands out. So these diagrams across the bottom come out of Ronald Haas's work from University of Florida, which this building typology that's native to Florida shows us the way forward for development of a single building into something grander, a single room into something grander. So utilizing that stretch, we take this really kind of simple plan and arrive with a 2-bedroom kind of little shell here, hall on either side with a living room that splits between. Now, traditionally, this would be understood as a dog trots house, where you might see it here, in which we have 2 buildings that are separated by an open space that's roof covering. And that works really well for us in this climate where we can have airflow be really helpful. But it also was a moment for us to think about how the building might expand or engage. So the kind of section perspective of the building, you can see that there's a utilization of mass timber to do the floors, the walls, and the roof. But then all of a sudden, the kind of thinness of the roof on top, maybe found material sets, or the siding or the elevation, which we'll get to in a second, might be a means to kind of give a cladding to the building that is, I think, a little bit more utilitarian and less about the pristine nature. Thinking back to the Delta homes is not trying to pursue something that's honorable, but pursue something that is about merits, if you will. The cross section here in the dog chart, you see that the building has one panel that pushes out. It's trying to utilize the local manufacturing techniques that we had available to us in Dothan. And all of that actually arrives to a strange moment for architecture, which is not the design of the building per se, but instead the design of the process. And we could say that the firm could kind of argue back and forth of whether this is important for its livelihood and the kind of discipline of architecture, but if its impact is important, its commitment to community, its commitment to the discipline, then I think it's at this moment that the practice has a lot to offer, designing the process of our buildings. So on the left-hand side, you see essentially the kind of smaller tool sets that are used, and we had to think through like every moment, like what's the minimum use of tool, what's the kind of mandated use of tools, and then what are the other things that we might need that are larger that potentially require some real assembly in the community, and that might be like a truck or a bobcat or even people power. The entire project was broken into a series of components and parts, which were cataloged, and most importantly, kind of to address the questions of Buckminster Fuller, trying to get to the fact of what the building really weighed, because it became important for the structure's kind of core DNA. Now, the other thing that our firm was working on at the time was understanding logistics. So the question is like, how do these buildings kind of come to? And so for the standpoint of the project, what we found is that this kind of large truck, like what is its range, what is its reach, and which is kind of minimal. But that range and reach actually defines the kind of scale of the panel, the scale of the kind of mass timber moment, right? These big platelets have to be moved into place somehow. And they do weigh something. And so what is that infrastructure that is required? And so a series of drawings that were associated between the scale of a truck and the scale of a building were kind of brought to life. Now, the other kind of small question that we dealt with was the relationship of the lots, the kind of urban infrastructure, to how that might be used for development of community. And on the left-hand side, you can see the typical 50 by 100-foot lot where we maybe have a home foundation that's remaining. This was designed to fit in that scenario in which it didn't compromise the development of the lots. where we maybe in lots that were kind of brought together, all of a sudden we can see organizations of these buildings, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second in terms of its 3 dimensions, but they come together to make community, which is slightly different. So again, we're not interested in the kind of pristine approach to architecture, but instead in something that's in between that kind of grittiness and the kind of honorable, if you will. What is the architecture that can actually be utilitarian while simultaneously addressing this craft of construction? So adding simple things like shading mechanisms like a soft architectures go a long ways. But the kind of the scale of the project, the materiality of the project are what give it its kind of heart and soul. Now, as it is assembled together in other units, you can see that the kind of Florida Cracker House DNA starts to arrive, where we have these moments of pass through, the thinnest thickness of the building, and that gives it kind of, I think, a groundedness in what the architecture of South Florida and Florida could really be. Okay, the interlude here for us is material testing. So the question about materiality is one that is always thought about as just the tactility of it. Do we touch it? Do we feel it? Is it got good light, etc.? But we're finding that we bump up against this idea of performance. And within our office, the idea of performance is critical. So what we started to look for is the relationship of materiality relative to its acceptance as a building process. So on the left-hand slide is a really kind of ragged image of a stamp. That stamp seems to be just faded and beat up, but there's an enormous amount of information tied up in that singular stamp that then became this kind of moment for our lab to grab onto and say, how do we break that apart so we understand what the performance of this materiality really is? How do we get it to be in a kind of an accepted moment? So um, the process of making this stuff is kind of in some ways barbaric, right? We take material that is dimensional lumber, we essentially slam that lumber together. Flashing light. Excuse me. So we take that lumber, we smash it together. We have essentially perpendicular moments of cross laminations, right? So one layer, next layer, organized orthogonal to each other. We put glue between those layers, and we just take a press and we smash it down. And that's what makes us are these massive panels. And this is the kind of gluing mechanism. You can see it's dirty and it's not really doing a whole lot for our aesthetics, right? But what we're kind of decoding inside of this mass timber as a means to engage in building policy. And that's actually the interest between our lab and practice. One of the fact that the lab can be this kind of non-biased thing that exists within academics, but it also is giving us this moment of, okay, we can engage in manufacturing, we can engage in policy. We're not serving anything other than the pursuit of answering questions that are put forth by these parties like Miami-Dade County Building, Planning, and Zoning. But then on the other side, our architecture allows us to kind of engage in this in the building set. So this fine balance allows us to kind of decode this material in a way that uh, pushes forward with the identification of testing. So right now we are finding that the state of Florida requires everything to have an NOA, which the mass timber products cannot really acquire at this point. We have to go through a series of tests. That test then was organized by our lab, and we're now on the tail end of it where we're the lab at the University of Miami has now been able to kind of get to the final stretch of submitting NOAs for mass timber across the Southeast, which is exciting. All right, so another project, House in a Garden, found on a website under a numbering system, which is accurate. Miami is a place of forests, believe it or not, just forests that aren't necessarily usable for building, but we have this kind of canopy which exists in Coconut Grove. This is the kind of dense fabric of Coconut Grove. Most of that building set is made up of single-story, low kind of tiny single-story buildings that are often stucco and concrete block. Occasionally you get this kind of wonderful moment of an old typological Bohemian fishing village. But this is the elevation of the street. This is the project in its context. This is a new project in its context. And you can kind of see the kind of breaking once we go to 2 stories, what happens to that scale. We're very compelled by that scale. So to look at the building plan, to walk you around before we go into some of the images, street out here, there's the kind of butting up against the other lot behind. There's an arrival court here, then a C-shaped plan. We've already fawned over the kind of identity of courtyard as a compelling building typology for us here. Nick and I share that greatly. But what we had to deal with is essentially a parking layer here, which actually compresses the building a little bit. That was a policy thing we're dealing with. What we then did was actually turn the building upside down, if you will, or inside out, or whatever you want to call it. So we have the kind of arrival sequence, which is driving deep into the site. Our good friend Frank Lloyd Wright talked a lot about that and did a lot of that work, getting us to a center court, which then arrives the entry here. As you might expect, Amazon delivery people were lost constantly, which is fine. But it kind of gives a moment of arrival deep into the site, and we kind of center that arrival sequence. Now, what is also important about this area is that there's always this nature of eyes on the street, right? There's a kind of a community here. They live on the street. They kind of are always out there, which is exciting because there's life over there. So what we wanted to make sure is that this public pavilion, which is in the back, represented by that blue bar, is always kind of connected through. So you could be in the very back of the lot and look all the way through the street and actually see people, wave at people. They can actually kind of sense there's a kind of a layering system to the site, which is exciting. The other thing that we have put into action here is a front porch, and then there's a little wall that was built out here. So this kind of layering approach is critical. We often come home to find kids in the neighborhood taking a break on our porch. There's a basketball goal out front, which is exciting and fun to have actual life. Now, the project is called House in a Garden, and House in a Garden means that this kind of thing is nestled underneath a treescape, which I kind of earlier talked about. And so the gardens kind of wrap around. So we have this long linear garden, there's the court gardens, and across the back there's the pool, and there's, you'll kind of sense it in a second, but there's trees that envelop that, and then there's these long stretches of gardens which are edible, most of them, across the line, and then again this front garden. But this is important because as the organization of the project, all of the spaces are essentially trying to gain access to those moments. We talked about early on the thick and the thin of the building. And for us, this kind of thick and thin moment meant that the building needed to be thin to get to cross ventilation, it needed to be thin to get to the gardens. We had to be careful about how that organization was really playing out. So you can see that these three spaces here all have access to the gardens as private. This space in the front has access to a garden here. Nobody is far from it, and everybody has a window on both sides of the space. Now, to kind of be academic for a second, to say that James Marston Fitz did lay out for us a very specific set of tasks to think about whenever we're working on homes in the kind of hot, humid climate. And so these kind of points here, 5 of these 7 points ring out. And I don't necessarily need to read them to you, but one of the things I want to point out is that the height of the walls were actually set by the manufacturer. So as you guys may be thinking about mass timber buildings, there's really a kind of a question about scale of materiality. The building height here is 11'3" for the wall. That is set by a manufacturer in maximal. So that's the kind of maximal width of a panel. And that was exciting to kind of generate a section on. For once, and I'll probably get yelled at for this later as well, but we had a chance to kind of walk away from the golden section for a moment and look at the kind of golden section for manufacturing. And that gave us a kind of a different language set to work with. You know, to poke fun at Nick for a second, for those that have been to the house, they believe that the proportions are nice. He doesn't. So the building section here, so you can kind of see roughly the kind of height of a scale of an individual amongst the building section. It's a really simple section: mass timber roof, mass timber walls, plinth, if you will, and then the kind of siding that comes alive that builds this relationship with exterior environmental conditions, which for us is quite exciting, also very simple. Mass timber, some insulation required by code, and then it became a series of standoffs which varied in depth that gave us the scallop form and then all the fastening that went along with it. So kind of quickly to look at the building in its construction phase, all of the walls and the roof went up in 2 days. So walls the first day, the roof the second day, and then on the third day, nothing biblical about it, but the building membranes went on to hold back the waters. You can see here we lack essentially this panel. There's one going in, and there's another one that's going to be laid out over the carport. You can kind of get the sense that the scale of the house, it is clearly a C-shaped courtyard structure, but it's actually low lying amongst the treescape that kind of hover around the top of it. So I'll walk you around the project and kind of in and through. So we're on the streetscape. We're getting ready to arrive to the court. We're entering into this court space as we move to the courtyard central section. Because of digital manufacturing, we're able to cut these wonderful curves in the space. You actually see that kind of this kind of arcing curve here, which is exciting for us, and as well as the kind of court gesture to the sky above. The tree here is much taller now, and it's got a really nice capacity to give dimpled and stippled light. Standing in the intersection, looking back at the landscape beyond, we have a kind of a large avocado tree, which is a wonderful moment for dappling light and food. And if you're a hipster, great avocado toast. Just making sure you guys are still live out there. Pavilion, you can see the kind of openness and the thinness of the building moving in and through. All of the walls and the roof are for the most part exposed, making this kind of like a wood box, if you will, which has other implications in terms of watching and monitoring the building. So standing in the living space, looking back towards the court, you can actually stand here and look across the court, back through the corridor and into the bedrooms beyond. It's a nice way for those that are parents to watch the children. You don't have to leave the living room to be able to see what's going on. And then standing kind of in amongst the kind of entry kitchen area, looking back towards the street, you can see all the way down to the street here, and then back towards the living space here, the kind of thinness of the plan. The plan itself is centered on every room having light and air from both directions. It makes it this kind of almost like an organism moving around the site. It's quite hard to sometimes define the envelope of the building. So staying in the very back of the lot, looking back towards the house, you can kind of start to see through the building diagonally. You can see in many different directions, and the kind of site becomes still porous, even though this structure exists on it and around it. There's a chicken coop here and then a big growing wall. Don't say anything about the chicken coop, please. The courtyard looking above, you can kind of see the kind of relationship of light. What I think is fascinating when you do art, when you can sit in the office, sit in the studio, and you draw and draw and draw, think about stuff. You're like, oh yeah, I've thought about it all. I'm the best that there is. Yeah, that's not how I'm just joking there. But ultimately, you never draw that moment where light is somehow getting up, hitting that, and reflecting on top of the CLT from below. It's quite magical. Or the fact that this window was going to have that pattern on it. We didn't design that stuff, but sometimes when you think about structures as layering, it kind of falls onto the structure for you. You get kind of fortunate. So now we look and say, how do we start to own that in our design process? And it's quite a wonderful moment. This is a window in the back of a shower, and this happens every day at between 3 and 7, depending on the season. So it's a kind of a quite wonderful painting that happens constantly. So talk a little bit more about the detail of the plan. You can kind of see, or the elevation. You can see the kind of long face here, the scalloping and the kind of ghostly figure. Looking at that kind of vertical image here up the scallop, you can see quickly, you can kind of understand how that scallop comes about. Very deep standoff, short standoff, deep standoff. Now, we often look, if you sent this to a contractor and you said, build this, they would say, it's going to cost, this is $1,000 a square foot thing. And you can laugh it off. And we have a lot of people that are kind of in and around us that are thinking about the kind of economies of material and how do you accomplish the complicated scenarios or wonderful moments without it costing an enormous amount, almost to kind of break a budget in a certain sense. Believe it or not, this is the cheapest elevation that we could come up with. Dimensional lumber, cut on a table saw, flat aluminum panels, cut in half by the manufacturer, come 2 foot by 12 foot, pushed into place, produce that scallop. It was the cheapest thing that we could do. And it turned out to be fairly kind of effective both monetarily, but also engaging with the place, to kind of go back to the lecture theme. So looking at how the corners resolved, and I'll come to this in a second about something that the drawings don't tell us, but we do draw through most of our details, trying, searching, hoping, and feeling our way through the project. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I want you to kind of think about this moment right here for a second, and then think about that moment for a second as we move into some photos. So what you can never think about, or like we always will slip by, is like the kind of porosity of the panel casting shadows, which is quite wonderful as like a depth or a layering to the facade system. Or the vertical standoff that holds the corner is now somehow not touching the building while touching the building. For us, this is kind of a really wonderful way for a building to have a fluffy edge where it's not there, it's there. It's kind of wonderful for us. Okay, so we have essentially one more moment of interlude and then a final little projected project for us. So community engagement for us is big, meaning that we try really hard to figure out how to connect with our local environmental conditions as well as our local population or people conditions. So some of the things that we've embarked on are trying to open up everything we can to students across the way. Now, I didn't have a photograph of you guys, or I would put it in here, but our building has essentially been in Coconut Grove as this kind of machine of learning. It's a constant tours, it's constant people coming through it, and it's hard because we have to start saying no at some point. But what it does do is it means that it continues to give back past what its kind of architecture as a building can really do in a single family residence, which is oftentimes closed down. We do things like partner with people like the Florida Forest Service to produce videos in terms of how to open markets for material and what that might mean for architecture. We take students out of architecture for a moment and we walk them into upstream contributors, taking them to the forest to kind of decode what the forest is like. For all of you that are working on these questions of energy and carbon, the forest is a really important moment for us because it has all of those kind of components made up in its trunk, bark, leaves, and roots. The students are learning about that all along the way. And then we also kind of run tours, not just for students, but for also for other professionals in the discipline. So we see here a set of student body. This is a bunch of faculty and professionals from University of Florida. And then again, a broader perspective of visiting a mass timber building, actually not in Miami. So we tour other buildings and we visit architecture. This is important. And I've kind of kept the wood theme here for a moment, suggesting that the work that we're going around and looking at kind of in the country is trying to find a way to understand our local condition by understanding somebody else's local condition. So taking people to see other things and you going as well is important. Well, here's the slide that's going to give all of you guys a bit of like a moment. I hope nobody's has issues with a crazy slide, if you will, for lighting conditions. But this is our process, believe it or not. We establish our project teams. We're trying to figure out what the prompt really says. We're trying to clear our eyes. We're trying to open our minds. We're looking for values in the project, understanding regions and local conditions, looking for logics, a place, if you will. And we're also trying to synthesize all that stuff. Now, I showed you this in a line, but the issue is that it doesn't exist in a line. It exists in this kind of feedback loop system, which is constantly evolving around this stuff. We might be bouncing back and forth, but they're always connected in a certain way. So that's the kind of chaos of the office in a certain sense. Last project, and then I'll answer any questions that are interesting to you guys. So the University of Florida has it's a good school. I don't know that it's as good as you guys. It's a good school. They have a forestry group, and that forestry group is looking for a new building. And that new building clearly should at least address some relationship of wood. So we started on this proposal, which is essentially a grant that our firm was able to acquire with the University of Florida, was to say, how can we conceive of a project? How do we convince somebody to do something? So this is slightly different, but it results in a rendering nonetheless for them to go work off of. But the project itself was really about converting essentially a process over. When a university starts something, it's a machine and it's hard to understand what that machine is going to do, but we know that that machine has standards and practices that they have to work off of. And so what we were trying to accomplish was, okay, what is it that you're trying to kind of to get from there? What is it that you're trying to do? And then how can we reframe that where you think about regional materials, regional resources, regional processes? So they have an integrated national resources group, and it's made up of a bunch of units. And so those units in one building have a lot of people, and those people want to get in that space. So what we need to do is allow the kind of space between to allow them in, right? So how do we let the building diagram be kind of really representational of a community that's moving back and forth? But their community is not just people; it's actually people, place, things, and trees, etc. And so all this stuff is meant to kind of move fluidly across this the building, if you will. It's one and the same. It's not just a place for people; it's a place for also their work and also the identity of the natural landscape. So for those that have been to the University of Florida, this is the North Lawn. They have a large kind of site that comes through, and there's this chunk of woods, McCarty Woods, that exists. Our goal was to say, okay, well, my goodness, you guys are a forestry group. Let's take that chunk of woods, let's bring it up and right to the kind of standpoint of the North Lawn. For those that understand the idea of a North Lawn or a lawn within the context of a university, it means that you're kind of presenting a face to that kind of university setting. So this would be the kind of arrival of the IFAS community, the forestry, fisheries, and geomatic sciences, water management, all of those groups kind of coming to the quad, if you will, to present itself. And so we thought, what better group to bring than the forest with them? So the building embraced that and said, okay, let's say take that kind of a moment here, and let's take that kind of forest, bring it up and through, bring it to the building set. But we have to acknowledge that the building is going to allow people to come into it and out of it, and there's hot spots, circulation patterns. So there's a number of studies that looked at that. And all those studies resulted in this kind of moment of hotspots being also recognition of where the forest might be the kind of greeter of the building. It might be the moment that allows that kind of recognition of arrival or being or learning as a kind of a colleague to the building that's always there. So these little biospheres started to show up for us. We looked at all of the things that they might be studying: flatlands, uplands, water zones, etc. And they maybe find their way as the kind of footprint of the building. And then we started to interlace the kind of moments, pathway that might meander through all of that, in which we kind of put something on top of it that unified it. But that unification had to also negotiate these biospheres. So we started to kind of move up and through and back and forth through the building itself. They are sometimes under it, they are sometimes in it, they are sometimes on it, and sometimes they are it, if you will. Okay, that was scary for a moment. As you guys might expect, a studio might go there and present something, and all of a sudden it doesn't show up. That wouldn't be good. The plan of the building looks a little bit like this, in which we have these kind of large biospheres that are moving back and forth. They're stuffing themselves into other areas of the campus. They're linking the kind of connection up and through to the North Lawn. A little bit of a model showing these biospheres being cut into and through the building itself. This section is where the building really comes to life, though, which we say all this program is kind of like stippled throughout the McCarty Woods that are brought up to the North Lawn. So we might find faculty spaces, staff spaces. We might find all that stuff kind of seemingly in what might be stratified if you didn't think about the forest as a negotiator. All of a sudden, pushing and pulling on those moments to give them an access to something, to kind of give them another colleague within the context of their work. And for us, that was these biospheres. The building, kind of from the North Lawn, you can kind of see that it's going to be nestled amongst a bunch of trees, and there's a whole symbol. But what is actually important for us is that everything kind of coexists. We have infrastructure running through the middle of the building, and we have kind of parking and storage being an anchor at one end. We actually have to have a kind of a face to the front, and then that corridor kind of makes its way in and through the whole building, under, through, up, and around. Again, some more kind of model photos of what the kind of building's going to host, essentially kind of rooftop garden spaces that poke through, spaces that are underneath, etc. So the last two images I'm going to show, and then we can have a discussion, hopefully. For us, the architecture of this building was the backdrop. It was merely the kind of sinew, the movement through, amongst other things. The other things for us was the place. And I kind of tie all this together, the kind of context for the University of Florida's work for the Forestry, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences program was to think about the woods as the main character, meaning that the building had to, in some ways, be a good colleague, a good host. It not only was made of the forest, it is the forest, and it's the backdrop to all of their work. And then you kind of see in this sense that it's just the piece that meanders through and becomes the kind of another character to that space. And as we think through the interior, what it's like to be up in the building and looking back towards the biospheres, you could sense that they are the focal point, that they are essentially the reason that you would come to this structure, as to be in and amongst this other kind of colleague, if you will. So the kind of in conclusion, the context of the office is to make sure that we don't overlook the things that are around us. I think it's kind of simple. We find ourselves traveling all over the world. We see there's a kind of an excitement in the internet at the tip of your finger, and it can often be a distraction for understanding what this kind of local set of conditions can offer. I think if we take time and we slow down, we believe in what's around us as important, we we'll find an architectural language which will develop a building that comes from the place, it's of the place, and for the place. With that, I want to thank you for your time and interest in the work, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you again. Are you guys going to be a quiet crowd? Please.
On the middle project, that you said there's those with the exposed exterior walls, all of the blue laminated timber there. What did you guys do about like the electrical wiring and all that in there?
The house.
Yeah, right. Well, because I guess we're trying to be prepared. I have a series of slides that run after. So here you go. So the nature of the project is to say, what does mass timber do to thinking about basic systems? And for us, it said the things that run in the wall can no longer run in the wall. They have to find a relationship either on one side or the other. And so the decentralized moment here is to say all of the HVAC is located in kind of quadrants, means it's a decentralized system. That's the first thing. And then all the kind of power outlets relied on a couple of things. One, the main meter running all the way into the center of the building where it would run up to the roof. And I'll show you what that looks like. And it's all kind of over the top of the roof, running kind of chaotic and then coming down. It's a down-fed system, if you will. The other thing that we do is we locate essentially strategically 3 walls here, 1, 2, 3, which are basic plumbing walls. They tend to be really intense walls in that moment. And so we can't hide everything everywhere all the time. But part of this is to think about the kind of stud nature of what a project can utilize as a means to address systems. So here's that switch bank. Everything comes in from the slab below, goes here, and then goes on top of the roof and runs wildly to all quadrants of the building. And then you can see actually in the backdrop here, there's furring on this wall, which is a bathroom. Almost invariably, all of the kind of CLT that's exposed, there's going to be moments where it can't be. Right? So like bathrooms and stuff like this, you cannot really just expose CO2 at that moment. Well, that's an opportunity to service both sides of the wall, if you will, with electrical. So HVAC, this moment, here's the kind of magic, if you will, if there's magic involved. So there's a grid that's on top of the building right here, and you can barely see it, but these elements aren't touching. They're all spaced apart. And all of the stuff is running in between all that and coming from the top down, if that makes sense. That's a long answer to your question, but yeah. Please.
What's the cost for this project? Because you mentioned that if you were to bring it to construction, it would be $1,000.
The $1,000 was me throwing something out there. I don't know what it was because I can't afford to ask. The cost I can tell you the cost is market value, meaning that it's not going to be, it wasn't more than what would have taken to build a normal house in Miami, not a wood house, a normal, like a CMU, whatever. And actually somewhat cheaper to some degree. I can't give you the direct answer because if you remember early on in the presentation, I said that we build a lot of stuff. I'd have to go back and kind of quantify all that time, which we weren't doing. We were just kind of trying to get from one point to another point, and that kind of fell by the wayside. But we do know that it's under market value for the cost for construction. I can tell you that. Just that you don't buy that, do you? So if you want to build something right now in Miami for single-family residence, I mean, everybody can kind of, who's practicing in here will tell you that it's hard to get things right now for less than $400 a square foot. And we're under that. So, I mean, it's probably more than that. Like some of the stuff that you're getting might be closer to 600. We're way, way under that. Which is where the 1,000 number. Here's a great little story. I think it's quite fascinating, and I'll come to the other question. I think it was Todd Williams was talking about how he was getting ready to go up for I think it was the Barnes Foundation. Since it's being recorded, Todd, don't get mad at me. I think it's just a great story that I heard from you. Going up for the Barnes Foundation, and he read in the newspaper the day before he goes in for the Barnes Foundation interview or something. He says, somebody had quoted saying, if you want a good museum, you're not going to pay less than $1,000 a square foot. That's just the bottom line. And it was a highfalutin architect, right? So Todd went into the interview, and they go, what do you think this is going to cost? He was like, yeah, it's good. There's no way it's going to be less than $1,000 a square foot. I'm just kind of quoting off of there. And help set the stage moving forward. I think it's quite kind of funny how that kind of cost for construction just kind of is a number thrown around without any real meat behind it. But I can promise you that it was less than that for sure.
Carlos.
Oh, sorry.
Did you find any issues in terms of like moisture retention and air quality building with wood in South Florida?
Moisture retention, the answer is no, because all the black you see here is breathable membrane. And this is actually the complication that our practice is trying to address, which is that historically speaking, building science for South Florida is kind of come to a standstill, meaning after 1992, when building processes changed to be CMU, core filled, treated stuff, for everything else, metal studs, flashings went away, window detailing went away, stucco became pervasive, whatever, which kind of suggests that like none of the membranes and that the rest of the country is using couldn't make it into this system because they just, one, they weren't driving with CMU, two, they were costed out, and three, they became complicated because of NOAs. So if you're a manufacturer and you want to sell something in South Florida, you need an NOA, which means you need to test. And you got a question like, is the market ready? So to talk a little bit about, to move back first, and I'll come forward, I promise. The reason why our lab is so keen on getting the NOA from mass timber is because if we didn't lead the effort, the manufacturers aren't going to do it. They would always just tell us, bring us a project, and we'll go after it. We're like, well, we did, and they didn't. And so we were like, well, maybe we can get funding from other sources to let an academic institution help be that kind of like grease to make the wheels roll. And it's worked. So the challenge, I guess, for us is to say, like, when is it the right time to be a practice that is interested in doing practice things, to practice what we're doing, to do what we're doing, if you will, to then have to step away and say, how do we get something to a point that we can actually practice it? And that was the kind of hope of the lab and firm partnership. That gives us a kind of a quite compelling workflow. Now, I'm trying not to be long-winded. My son's here, and he'll laugh at that statement. You guys didn't, but he will. The moisture management. This project has been very, very good. 13% moisture. They've stayed that way. Actually, all of the material that is here, so all of this material in the construction phase was never sealed. There's no oil on it. It's just raw wood. And it's still that way. And it still looks like that, except a little darker. So the moisture conditions are actually based on detailing. And you can see the number of drawings we've showed you. Detailing was very critical for us. This is something as architects you guys have to mandate and do and think through and actually pursue. Also, somebody else will do it or not. And the not is the scariest part. So the water has been pretty good. Also, our assembly is belts and suspenders. There's tons of drain planes and other stuff in there. We could dive into that in tech questions, but there's a lot of ways out for water. Does that answer everything you wanted to know about life? Yeah.
No, that was a good question, and he answered. I have a quick question. In terms of permitting,
Okay.
you guys, I would imagine, I don't remember if you say that, I'm sorry, if it was an empty lot, but you have to go through all Sunday, right?
This thing went through all the permitting phases that every project would go through. The only thing that was different with this is because of our academic relationship, we were able to help provide access to other kind of testing routes and getting together a bunch of, we have other presentations that deal specifically with that. Actually, one that will be given on Thursday for New Orleans Coat. But the relationship for permitting meant that our lab was able to kind of get together the APA, the AWC, Woodworks, all these people and say, the U.S. Forestry Service, and say, what ballistics testing do you have? And can we make that parallel stream for Miami-Dade County? And we were able to do so. Believe it or not, and for those that are practicing in the crowd, to get a permit in Miami-Dade County, it can be from 7 months to 7 years. Like it can be, I know it's kind of maybe fall on deaf ears, and maybe 5 years from now when you guys go out and practice or like you find us, you'll laugh back at what I said. This permit was about a 8-month process with the one-time approval through that Miami-Dade County where we didn't ask for variances. No variances for roof overhangs, no variances for Nothing, except for the one-time approval for the mass timber. And it was 7 months, and the project was about a year. We started construction June 14th, 15th, 16th with the CMU, the CLT. See, like I'm already being trained to say CMU. And then a month before that, I guess, so May, the foundations went in, and we moved in about 9 months later, 10 months later. I don't know if that answers everything you were, yep.
You have a question?
Oh, don't, no, nope. Oh. Yeah. Oh, it's a plant. Not really. This is a non-architectural grade panel. This is an architectural grade panel. You can see there's one knot there. There's one hiding behind that ladder. This is a difference in trees that are structurally stable but not aesthetically interesting for most people. And this is trees that are both, I guess they would be the model of trees. They are both structurally stable. Probably not actually, if they're structurally stable. Structurally stable and aesthetically stable. So this is actually what the kind of the beauty of the panel shows up in both structure and aesthetics. Thank you for that question.
It's a problem when you bring your clients to the lecture.
Yes, this is a bad issue. Anything else that I can answer? Any other questions? Nothing? Please. Yes.
So,
Wait, did you see the presentation? Oh,
so once you obtain the NOA, and you have the application to build with mass timber, what, I guess, what steps do you think would be necessary to get over the stigma, I guess, that wood construction has in South Florida?
the only way to get over stigmas in South Florida is to make them cheap. This is a money question. This is nothing other than a money question. So if you can find a way for something to be a cheaper way to build, it will be built that way. They showed you that in the slide that I had up of the Hurricane Andrew and all of those wood frame houses. They weren't building that because they thought it was a better construction. They built that because it was cheaper.
Fast.
And fast, speed, time. Time is money. I'm not an economist and I don't even play one on TV, but when we think about the relationship of how to get something from tested into action, there's so many forces that come into play, but we know the most significant one is money. Now for us, what we are worried about less as a practice and more as a lab, when we find a way to get the NOA, which is on the doorstep right now, and mass timber becomes something that's applicable, and everybody in here can go buy it and use it, and every firm can use it, and developer can, they can submit for it. The problem is that we have essentially said, here is something new, that's sustainable, that's regionally sourced, that's healthy, that's grown. It's the only grown material that we have available to us here in South Florida to use, really. It's not the only grown material, but it's the only grown one that we can build with. We're going to find that what's going to be brought along are all of the techniques for doing CMU buildings and put on top of wood structures. And what our concern is that we're going to find that those aren't going to work, and we're going to see failures. And so our thing moving forward after the NOA is accomplished with the lab is that our goal is to actually unleash more educational opportunities, in particular for Miami-Dade County, so when they see these projects come through, that they know what questions to ask and how to kind of develop envelopes that are for success and making sure that we're not putting in wood in a position to fail. Our kind of concern is not actually about whether or not it will be implemented. It's how the implementation works. For how do we build? That's our question. I know again, I said it seems simple, but it's how do we build? It's coming. It's just whether or not we're going to do the right things when they come up, or whether cost is going to erode or blind our decision making. We don't follow economy blindly. We follow it in a way that makes sense. I don't know the best thing moving forward, but we're trying. We only try. That's what we're like. As an academic moment, we're just saying it's now available. Do smart things with it. Now, hopefully they do. I know what I'm saying. I know what I'm saying. I know where I'm saying it to. In Miami, it's complicated. Anything else, please?
You mentioned before that you have all these systems running underneath the building. Are those
to the spaces and are they ever going to be able to be changed? Or is this a kind of style that once you arrange it a certain way, that's going to be the lifetime of the building?
It's a very good question. So most of the systems that are under the slab are traditional systems. So anything under the concrete that you're seeing here, that's traditional. And actually in an interesting way, it all goes from here to there, down that corridor and out. So changes in that stuff is traditional changes. Now, changes to the things that are on the roof, changes to things that are on the roof are accessible only if you were to redo the roof. And yes, this is the question for us moving forward. And we're actually handling it differently on projects that we're working on currently. We're running things more in chase-like moments where that chase is able to be accessible. We're identifying that chase as something that we can get into, if you will. We're thinking about it as more of a kind of a design system. I will say that part of this approach was actually dealing with the kind of pressures of time on this project. And so we know that it's not the perfect solution. We know that it's the beginning of the development of a language for solutions. And so that's the kind of mentality we're taking on. There are moments that can be fixed and accessed, et cetera, meaning that where all that stuff came into, which is about right here in plan, it goes into a bathroom, and there's other moments that we can tag onto that are decentralized over here, for instance, in this bathroom, et cetera. So the building could have some changes. It's not going to be like invariably flexible. I would just point you to say, if you've done any remodeling in any kind of CMU home or any CMU structure, you'll notice that they're not easily fixed either. So neither one of us are having good solutions. We're fighting to get there, and that's the attempt. The change in the kind of current solution for CMU is to just route conduit on the exterior or interior, and that's a problem for the most part. We're trying to stay away from that, but we're working on those solutions. We don't have it perfect, but we're heading there. Yeah. Anything else?
All right. Oh, I think
Oh, he's wrapping up. Oh.
we're ready to go back to studio.
Where do I'm cutting the studio. Well, I want to, before we go, thank you for the invitation. Congratulations again on being part of a really wonderful school. Good luck as you guys move through the program. I think that your faculty, believe it or not, and I'm sure you're probably going to hate when I say this, they deserve an applause, coffee, whatever. They're doing great work for you guys. Great work for you guys.